On the morning of November 13, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal lay shrouded in darkness, so complete that men aboard Japanese warships could barely see their own hands before their faces. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe stood on the bridge of the battleship Hiei, watching the impenetrable night fold around his fleet like a protective cloak. The tropical air hung thick with moisture, and visibility had dropped to less than 500 meters. Perfect conditions, he thought, for what the Imperial Japanese Navy did best. His force of 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers had trained for decades in night combat operations, mastering techniques that made them the undisputed masters of darkness on the seas. The American forces ahead, he believed, would never see them coming until Japanese shells were already tearing through their hulls. What Admiral Abe did not know, could not have imagined in that confident moment, was that 27 kilometers away, glowing green screens were painting a perfect picture of every ship in his formation, tracking their approach with mechanical precision that rendered darkness utterly meaningless. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how confidence built on centuries of naval tradition met technology that rewrote the rules of warfare in a single night, and how men who believed they owned the darkness discovered they had been sailing in plain sight all along. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless stood in the cramped Combat Information Center aboard the light cruiser Helena, watching the SG surface search radar screen with an intensity that made his eyes burn. The green sweep painted across the scope, and with each rotation, the contacts became clearer. 13 distinct returns moving in formation, bearing 310 degrees, ranged 24,000 meters and closing. He reached for the voice tube connecting him to the bridge, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. The radar equipment humming quietly around him represented a revolution that most of the U.S. Navy was still learning to trust. The SG radar, installed on only a handful of ships, could detect surface targets at ranges that would have seemed like science fiction just 2 years earlier. While the Japanese had invested everything in superior optics, night vision training, and the legendary long-lance torpedo, American scientists had been perfecting the ability to see with radio waves. The contrast between these two philosophies, one rooted in human skill and traditional seamanship, the other in electronic innovation and industrial technology, was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. On the bridge of the Helena, Captain Gilbert Hoover received McCandless's report and felt his pulse quicken. The Japanese were coming, exactly as intelligence had predicted, but far sooner than expected. The American force, designated Task Group 67.4, consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan aboard the heavy cruiser San Francisco. They had been positioned to intercept a Japanese bombardment force heading for Henderson Field, the crucial airstrip on Guadalcanal that had become the focal point of a grinding campaign in the Solomon Islands. What made this moment extraordinary was not just that the Americans knew the Japanese were coming, but that they knew precisely where every enemy ship was, how fast they were moving, and exactly when they would arrive, all while the Japanese fleet sailed blind into what they assumed was empty ocean. The technological advantage was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost unfair. Yet the coming battle would prove that technology alone could not guarantee victory, that human factors, training, doctrine, and the fog of war could still turn advantage into chaos. Admiral Abe, meanwhile, stood in the confidence of experience that stretched back through a lifetime of naval service. The Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated every night engagement in the campaign so far. At the Battle of Savo Island in August, Japanese forces had surprised an Allied fleet and inflicted one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history, sinking 4 cruisers and damaging 2 others without losing a single ship. The Americans, Abe knew from these victories, were clumsy in darkness, dependent on searchlights that gave away their positions, slow to react, unable to coordinate their forces effectively, without visual contact. His battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, had been loaded with special bombardment ammunition, high-explosive shells designed to devastate the airfield and its installations. Each battleship carried over 900 shells, enough firepower to render Henderson Field completely inoperable. The Marine and Army pilots who flew from that strip had been inflicting terrible damage on Japanese supply convoys, sinking transport ships, and making it nearly impossible to resupply Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal. Tonight, that threat would be eliminated, Abe believed, and the troop transports waiting to the north, carrying thousands of reinforcements, would land unopposed once the American air power was neutralized. Commander Masao Nishida, gunnery officer aboard the Hiei, supervised the loading of the bombardment ammunition with meticulous care. Each shell weighed nearly 800 kilograms, and the process of loading 14-inch guns in rolling seas required precision and experience his crew had in abundance. But a nagging concern troubled him, one that he could not completely dismiss despite his respect for his admiral's judgment. If they encountered American warships before reaching the bombardment position, they would need armor-piercing shells, not high-explosive rounds. Switching ammunition types would take precious time they might not have in a sudden engagement. He mentioned this to Admiral Abe, approaching the subject with the careful deference expected of a junior officer addressing a flag officer. Abe dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand, his tone patient but firm. American ships, he explained, would not be operating in these waters at night. Their radar was primitive, useful perhaps for aircraft detection, but unreliable for surface search, or so Japanese intelligence had assessed. American doctrine emphasized daylight engagements, where superior industrial production could overwhelm Japanese skill through sheer numbers. No, Abe insisted, they would reach the bombardment position unopposed, complete their mission, and withdraw before dawn brought American aircraft hunting for them. The Admiral's confidence was not baseless arrogance built on nothing but pride. It was constructed on a foundation of repeated victory, on tactical doctrines refined through years of study and practice, on the proven superiority of Japanese optics and night vision equipment. The Japanese had invested enormous resources in developing binoculars and rangefinders that could extract every possible photon of light from darkness. Their lookouts trained for thousands of hours to detect the faintest contrasts on the horizon, learning to distinguish the silhouette of a ship from the play of moonlight on waves. They had developed tactics for coordinating fleet movements without radio communication, using signal flags and shaded lamps visible only to friendly ships, positioned exactly where they were supposed to be. What they had not developed had in fact neglected almost entirely despite warnings from some forward-thinking officers, was radar technology that could match what the Americans and British had achieved. Aboard the Helena, the radar picture continued to sharpen with each sweep of the antenna. Lieutenant McCandless could now distinguish the larger capital ships from the escorting destroyers by the size and intensity of their returns on the scope. He called out ranges and bearings in a steady stream, information that flowed to the plotting table where officers translated the electronic data into tactical reality using grease pencils on transparent plotting boards. The Japanese formation was in column, with destroyers leading, then the two battleships followed by more destroyers and the light cruiser bringing up the rear. Classic formation for a bombardment run, exactly what you would expect from an admiral who believed he was sailing into undefended waters, where the only threat would come after his mission was complete. Admiral Callahan, aboard the San Francisco, faced a complex decision that would shape how the battle developed. His radar-equipped ships, Helena and the destroyer O'Bannon, could see the enemy clearly, tracking them like hunters watching prey through a scope. But his flagship lacked the new equipment, leaving him partially blind, dependent on reports from other ships. Trying to form a coherent tactical picture from fragmentary information that arrived through voice radio and signal lamps. The temptation must have been overwhelming to transfer his flag to a radar-equipped vessel, but naval tradition and the chaos of wartime operations made such a move impractical in the time available. He ordered his force into a single column formation, placing his destroyers at front and rear with the cruisers in the middle. It was a formation designed for simplicity of command and control, reducing the chances of friendly ships firing on each other in the confusion of night combat, where identification was difficult and mistakes could be catastrophic. But it also negated many of the advantages radar provided, forcing ships to rely on visual identification before firing, giving up the possibility of ambush from multiple directions that radar awareness might have enabled. At 12,000 meters range, lookouts aboard the Japanese ships finally spotted the American formation, dark shapes against the slightly lighter horizon. The surprise was total and stunning. Abe had expected empty seas, a quick bombardment run, an easy withdrawal under cover of darkness. Instead, his bombardment force had sailed directly into a waiting American fleet positioned exactly where they could intercept him. On the bridge of the Hie, controlled chaos erupted as officers shouted orders to change course, to prepare for surface engagement, to begin the laborious process of replacing bombardment ammunition with armor-piercing shells that could actually damage enemy warships. But the Americans had already been tracking them for over 20 minutes, watching them close the distance, positioning their own ships, preparing their gun crews, discussing tactics over voice radio. The surprise that should have belonged to the Japanese, the advantage of choosing when and where to attack that had won them previous victories, had been completely inverted by technology they did not possess and could not counter with traditional skills. Ensign Robert Hagen, manning a gun director aboard the cruiser Atlanta, watched through his optical sight as shapes began to materialize in the darkness ahead. The Japanese were close now, terrifyingly close, well inside the range where their superior optics and night fighting training should have given them overwhelming advantage. But the American ships had been positioned perfectly, their guns already trained on targets they had been tracking electronically, while the Japanese were still searching visually, their fire control solutions calculated and ready. The battle that erupted shortly after 1:30 in the morning was unlike anything either Navy had experienced, a chaotic melee that combined cutting-edge technology with point-blank gunnery that would have been familiar to naval officers from a century earlier. At ranges sometimes dropping below 2,000 meters, ships passed so close that men could see the silhouettes of enemy deck crews scrambling to their stations. The Americans, despite their radar advantage, struggled with identification in the chaos of gunfire and smoke. Admiral Callahan's repeated commands to stand by to open fire created agonizing delays as ships tried to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, trying to match what they saw through binoculars with what the radar was showing on the scopes below decks. The Japanese, recovering from their initial shock with the discipline and training that made them formidable opponents, began to employ the night fighting tactics they had perfected through extensive practice. Their long-lance torpedoes, superior to anything in the American arsenal, began to find targets. The destroyer Barton was struck and sank in less than a minute, torn apart by a torpedo explosion that broke her back. The destroyer Laffey, pressing close to engage the Hiei, was overwhelmed by point-blank fire from multiple Japanese ships. The heavy cruiser San Francisco, Admiral Callahan's flagship, engaged what her crew believed was an enemy vessel, searchlights stabbing through the darkness to illuminate a target. Only after firing did they realize with horror that they had been shooting at the friendly cruiser Atlanta. The Atlanta, already damaged by Japanese destroyer torpedoes, absorbed shells from her own side in a catastrophic breakdown in coordination that radar should have prevented but could not, because the ships using their eyes could not reconcile what they saw with what the radar operators were reporting from below decks. Admiral Callahan was struck down when Japanese shells hit the San Francisco's bridge, destroying the command center in a single devastating salvo. The loss of the task force commander in the middle of a confused night battle added to the chaos, with individual ship captains fighting their own actions without centralized coordination. Admiral Abe, aboard the Hiei, found his flagship transformed from predator to prey as American cruisers and destroyers closed from multiple directions, pumping shells into the massive battleship at ranges where even medium-caliber guns could penetrate her superstructure. The Hiei, designed to exchange fire with enemy battleships at 20,000 meters, where her heavy armor would be decisive, found herself in a point-blank brawl where her thick belt meant nothing against the sheer volume of fire tearing through everything above the waterline. Shells smashed into her bridge, her fire control stations, her secondary battery positions. Fires broke out in multiple locations, and the ship's ability to fight as a coordinated unit began to break down as communications were severed, and damage control parties struggled to contain the destruction. Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda, damage control officer on the Hie, raced through smoke-filled passageways trying to organize firefighting teams and shore up damaged compartments. The ship had been hit more than 50 times, not by the armor-piercing rounds her thick belt could have resisted at longer ranges, but by a hurricane of smaller shells that devastated everything above the waterline. The bridge was wrecked. The fire control systems were failing. Gan flames were spreading through compartments loaded with the high-explosive bombardment ammunition that was supposed to have devastated Henderson Field, but now threatened to destroy the ship from within. The supreme irony was not lost on him. Even in the chaos of trying to save his ship, they had loaded the wrong ammunition for the wrong battle, having been caught completely by surprise in conditions that were supposed to guarantee Japanese surprise and Japanese victory. Every assumption that had guided their planning had been wrong, and now they were paying the price in a battle they should never have had to fight. The engagement lasted only 24 minutes of sustained firing, though to the men fighting it must have seemed like hours. When the guns finally fell silent and surviving ships withdrew into the darkness, the ocean off Guadalcanal was littered with wreckage, burning ships, and sailors struggling in oil-slicked water. The Americans had lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with every surviving ship damaged to some degree. Japanese losses were initially lighter in terms of ships sunk, 1 destroyer, and several ships damaged. But the battleship Hiei had suffered catastrophic damage to her steering and propulsion systems that would prove fatal. As dawn broke on November 13th, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed grotesquely beautiful after the night's horror, the Hiei wallowed helplessly in waters now controlled by American aircraft from Henderson Field, the very airfield she had been sent to destroy. Commander Nishida, still alive despite the carnage around him, stood on the listing deck and watched aircraft approach, black dots against the morning sky that grew larger with terrifying speed. The battleship's anti-aircraft crews fired desperately, filling the sky with bursting shells, but the ship could barely maneuver, making her an easy target for pilots who had trained extensively to attack exactly this kind of target. Wave after wave of American dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the day, pressing home their attacks with courage that Nishida could recognize and respect, even as their bombs and torpedoes tore his ship apart. The Hiei, which should have been safely withdrawn under cover of darkness, which should have completed her mission and returned to base to prepare for the next operation, instead became a floating target for every American aircraft in range. Fires raged out of control in multiple compartments. The pumps could not keep up with flooding, and the ship settled lower and lower in the water as the day progressed. By evening, with fires raging out of control and the ship settling by the bow at an angle that made standing difficult, the order came to abandon ship. The crew evacuated in an organized fashion despite the desperate circumstances, launching boats and rafts, helping wounded comrades into the water, maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into them through years of training. The Hiei, a veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor and numerous other operations, slipped beneath the waves as darkness returned, taking with her the illusion that Japanese mastery of night combat could overcome American technological advancement. Admiral Abe, transferred to a destroyer after his flagship became uninhabitable, faced the crushing weight of failure as he watched the rescue operations. He had lost a battleship, something the resource-starved Japanese could ill afford in a war of attrition against an industrial power that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Worse, he had failed to destroy Henderson Field, meaning the troop convoy waiting to the north could not proceed safely, and the entire operation to retake Guadalcanal had suffered a serious setback. The operation had collapsed because the Americans had been waiting for him, had known exactly where he was, had prepared their ambush while he sailed confidently into darkness that was not dark at all to their electronic eyes. The recriminations began immediately upon his return to headquarters. How had the Americans known they were coming? There were theories about code breaking, about spies who had somehow transmitted information about the operation, about lucky patrol aircraft that might have spotted the force despite the darkness. Few in the Japanese command structure understood or accepted that American radar had reached a level of capability that fundamentally changed naval warfare. The idea that an electronic device could track ships at ranges beyond visual range through darkness and weather, mapping their positions with precision, seemed too fantastic to believe. or perhaps too threatening to acknowledge, because it meant that fundamental assumptions about naval warfare were no longer valid. Lieutenant Commander McCandless, back in Pearl Harbor weeks later, after the Helena's damage was repaired and she had returned for more extensive work, found himself briefing intelligence officers and radar specialists about the battle. The radar, he explained, had tracked the Japanese force from initial detection through the entire engagement, providing constant updates on enemy positions even when smoke and darkness made visual contact impossible. The Americans had known the enemy's composition, formation, speed and bearing with precision that would have seemed magical a few years earlier. What had failed was not the technology, but the human element, the ability of commanders to trust information their eyes could not confirm, to integrate electronic data into tactical decisions faster than doctrine and training had prepared them for, to maintain coordination in the chaos of close-range combat, where the traditional methods of fire control still dominated. The battle off Guadalcanal in November 1942 was not the largest naval engagement of the Pacific conflict, nor the most decisive in terms of ships sunk or strategic objectives achieved. But it marked a turning point in how naval warfare would be conducted for the rest of the conflict and beyond. The Japanese, masters of night combat, through optical superiority and intensive training that had made them genuinely formidable opponents, discovered that all their advantages meant nothing against an enemy who could see them coming from beyond the horizon. In subsequent engagements, American radar capabilities only improved. The SG radar that had equipped the Helena was installed on more and more ships as production ramped up. Fire control radars allowed guns to track and engage targets without visual contact at all, calculating firing solutions automatically and updating them continuously. The Japanese, facing industrial capacity that allowed the Americans to produce ships faster than they could be sunk, also faced a technological gap that their superior tactics and training could not overcome no matter how hard they fought. Admiral Abe was relieved of command and spent the rest of the war in administrative positions far from the fleet he had once led into battle. The confidence he had felt on November 13th, the certainty that darkness and weather favored the skilled Japanese forces, had been shattered by technology he had underestimated and an enemy who had changed the fundamental rules of engagement. In his reports and subsequent testimony to investigating boards, there is a sense of almost bewildered frustration, of a man who played by rules that no longer applied, discovering that his opponents had changed the game entirely while he had been perfecting his play within the old framework. For the American forces, the battle reinforced lessons about the importance of technological development and the challenges of integrating new capabilities into existing doctrine. Radar won the strategic advantage, providing the Americans with awareness and positioning that traditional methods could never match. But tactical execution still depended on human judgment, on the ability of commanders to process information and make decisions faster than their opponents, on the training of crews to translate electronic data into effective action on the gun line. The sailors who survived the battle carried their own memories, different from the official reports and strategic analyses. Men like Ensign Hagen, who watched ships appear and disappear in the darkness and gun smoke, who felt the concussion of shells passing overhead close enough to hear their whistle, who saw the ocean lit by burning vessels and exploding ammunition. They had fought in a transitional moment, when one era of naval warfare was dying and another being born, when the traditional skills of the naval officer, the trained eye and tactical intuition built on visual information, were being supplemented and eventually replaced by the interpretation of electronic displays. In the decades after the war, radar technology became so ubiquitous, so fundamental to naval operations, that it became difficult to imagine how ships had ever operated without it. The idea of fleets groping through darkness, dependent on lookouts with binoculars, coordinating movements through signal lamps and flag hoists, seemed almost quaintly primitive to officers who had grown up with radar as a basic assumption. But in November 1942, these were cutting-edge capabilities being tested in desperate circumstances against an enemy who had refined traditional methods to their absolute peak. The technological arms race that radar represented would continue throughout the war and beyond, driving development of countermeasures and counter-countermeasures, spurring innovation in electronics and signal processing. The Japanese, recognizing the disadvantage after painful experience, attempted to develop their own radar systems, but they never closed the gap. American industrial capacity, scientific infrastructure, and the integration of university research into military development created advantages that Japanese forces, skilled and determined as they were, could not overcome through superior training or fighting spirit alone. The lesson of that night off Guadalcanal echoed through subsequent conflicts and continues to resonate in military thinking today. Technology does not automatically guarantee victory. Battles are still won or lost by human decisions and the courage of individuals under fire. But technological superiority creates advantages that skill and bravery alone cannot overcome. Admiral Abe's confidence in darkness as an ally, built on years of successful operations and careful training, was rendered obsolete by scientists and engineers who had found a way to turn night into day through electronic means. For the Marines and soldiers on Guadalcanal, desperately defending Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attempts to recapture it, the naval battle offshore meant survival. The Japanese bombardment force had been turned back, the troop convoy had been forced to withdraw, and the airfield remained operational. American aircraft would continue to attack Japanese supply lines, slowly strangling the Japanese forces on the island, contributing to an eventual American victory in the Guadalcanal campaign that marked the beginning of the long Allied advance across the Pacific. The sailors who perished that night, American and Japanese both, gave their lives in a battle that demonstrated the brutal reality of warfare in transition. They fought with tremendous courage on both sides, Japanese crews trying to execute a mission they had trained for extensively, American crews adapting to new technologies and new tactical possibilities while still learning how to use them effectively. The confusion, the mistakes, the instances of ships firing on friendly forces, the inability to exploit radar advantages fully because doctrine and training had not caught up with capability. All of these reflected the painful process of military adaptation under combat conditions. Commander Nishida, who survived the sinking of the Hiei and eventually returned to Japan after being rescued from the water, spent years after the war analyzing what had happened to his ship and his navy. In conversations with historians and fellow veterans, he acknowledged that Japanese naval doctrine had been fundamentally sound for the conditions and technology available in the 1930s. The emphasis on night fighting, on superior optics, on intensive training in visual recognition and torpedo tactics had created a force that was genuinely formidable and had achieved remarkable victories. But doctrine built on one set of technological assumptions became a vulnerability when those assumptions no longer held, when the enemy developed capabilities that rendered traditional advantages meaningless. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.